Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're wading into something pretty significant. It's one of the most, well, intellectually charged and, frankly, emotionally weighty disputes in neuroscience right now.
Yeah, it touches on the very definition of autism itself.
Exactly. We're diving into a whole stack of source material around this really high-profile 2025 paper. It came from a Cambridge-led group published in Nature.
And it made a huge claim, a monumental one, really.
Didn't it just, they basically suggested that autism should be, like, functionally split into two distinct underlying factors.
And the key difference between these two supposed groups, it sounds almost too simple, it's the age a person gets their formal diagnosis.
Right. On the surface, you think, okay, that sounds like science. Observe a pattern, propose a biological reason for it. Straightforward.
But then you look at the critique, the source material we've analyzed, and it's coming from, within the neurodivergent community, from disability study scholars.
And it throws down a major challenge.
A major one. It argues this whole scientific partitioning thing. It's not actually biological discovery, not at all. It's described as repackaged exclusion, a very sophisticated form of it.
Wow. Okay. That completely reframes the whole thing, doesn't it?
That really does.
So the core mission for our deep dive today is exactly that, to unpack this conflict. When these, very high-profile researchers use age at diagnosis to define genetic subtypes, are they actually tapping into some inherent biological truth? Or are they, maybe without realizing it, just indexing things like access to resources, systemic privilege, maybe even institutional gatekeeping?
It's such a fundamental question. It challenges the research framework itself, right?
Yeah.
It forces us to ask, what if the data isn't showing us two types of brain, but maybe two types of societal access?
Okay. Oh, let's get into it. We should probably look first at the original study, what puzzle they said they were trying to solve.
Yeah, the stated aim.
Then dig into why the critique calls these categories manufactured. And finally, what does it all mean, for the millions of people diagnosed later in life if this framework gets accepted?
Right. So starting at the beginning, the paper itself. It's Zhang, Grove, Gu, and others. Nature 2025, Cambridge-led cohort.
Okay.
And the source critique makes a point of noting that, okay, the authors are contemporary, but the kind of lab logic, the foundational assumptions, how they frame the problem, it seems deeply influenced by, let's say, historical figures and previous research streams from that institution.
Interesting. And the specific puzzle they set out to solve was timing.
Timing, exactly.
Yeah.
The question they posed was, if autism is fundamentally neurodevelopmental, something emerging in early childhood, why are so many autistic people not actually getting diagnosed until, mid-childhood?
Well,
or adolescence, or even adulthood?
They saw that late timing as a kind of scientific anomaly that needed explaining.
Yeah, that discrepancy is the whole starting point for their genomic search. See, historically, researchers have really struggled to find clean, reproducible genetic results for autism.
All right, the whole heterogeneity problem.
Exactly. That's the word they use.
Yeah.
The idea is that everyone diagnosed is so different that when you do these big genome-wide association studies, GWAS, the results just look messy. No clear signal.
If you're not familiar with GWAS, maybe think of it like scanning thousands, even millions of genetic variations across many people to find links to a specific trait or condition.
Right. And if the group you're studying is too diverse, the signal gets weak or confusing. That's the heterogeneity issue.
So the Zhang study comes along and says, what? We have a solution.
Pretty much. They propose that the age of diagnosis itself might be heritable. They hypothesize that autism isn't just one single genetic architecture.
But two
distinct polygenic factors, meaning like two types driven by the combined effects of many small genetic variations, and by cutting the population in half using age of diagnosis as the knife.
Earlier diagnosed here, later diagnosed there.
Precisely. They hoped to basically tame the heterogeneity, make the groups less internally diverse, reveal cleaner genetic signatures for each one.
So they're trying to create two pure genetic samples, essentially. And the tool they're using to sort people is simply the date on their diagnosis paperwork.
And the underlying assumption is that that date, that timing, is a reliable proxy for your underlying biology, your developmental pathway.
Okay, but this is exactly where the critique digs in and says, hold on a minute.
Right. The critique argues very strongly that you cannot take a social outcome the date a doctor or a system finally recognize something and treat it like a clean biological input.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting, because the source material we read argues that age at diagnosis is, well, it's anything but a clean signal of development. It calls the whole diagnostic process a kind of societal bottleneck. where things like social factors, demographics, systemic issues, they don't just influence the timing. The critique says they largely explain it.
So you think you're modeling genes?
But you might actually just be modeling access.
That's the core reframing. It's powerful. The critique details what actually dictates an early diagnosis in practice, especially in systems like the UK or the US, where, let's be honest, resources are limited.
So it's not just about how severe the traits look.
Rarely just that. The sources argue it's overwhelmingly correlated with privilege.
So who ends up in that early diagnosed group, according to this critique?
Well, it's often kids whose families have the money for private assessments, to skip the queues. Families who understand how to navigate really complex bureaucratic systems, insurance, schools.
Who can afford maybe to take time off work for appointments, for advocacy.
Exactly, without facing, financial ruin. So the cohort gets filtered right from the start based on these very practical, non-biological factors.
And what's the result of that filtering? What kind of profile emerges in the early group?
The critique argues it skews heavily towards the existing prototype, the one that's kind of baked into the diagnostic manuals, like the DSM.
You mean the sort of classic presentation?
Often, yes. The child who presents externally in the way that's most expected. Often male, often white, often with language development that follows that sort of standard analytic progression.
Because the screening tools, the professionals, they're sort of calibrated to spot that presentation most easily.
That seems to be the argument. That prototype gets the stamp of legitimacy earlier.
Okay, so that's the early side. Now let's flip it. If early diagnosis often requires privilege, what does a late diagnosis indicate, according to this view?
Well, conversely, late diagnosis is often seen as a direct consequence of systems that are sometimes explicitly designed to ration recognition.
How so?
Think about, say, austerity measures cutting public health funding. Think about insurance companies refusing coverage, or the incredibly long waiting lists in public systems.
Or schools, maybe.
Yeah.
Giving some support through like an IEP or a SEND plan, but maybe actively avoiding a formal diagnostic label.
Exactly. That happens a lot. It meets an immediate need, perhaps, but it delays formal recognition.
So who gets caught in those cues? Who tends to be diagnosed much later, teens, 20s, even older?
The source material points very specifically to populations often missed or misinterpreted by the standard tools and assumptions. Girls and AFA individuals who might mask heavily, children of color whose autistic traits might be misread through cultural or racial bias, may be seen as behavioral issues instead.
Right.
Poor or working class kids whose parents might lack the resources, the time, the energy to fight the system, and also individuals who are Gestalt language processors.
Can you unpack that last one a bit? Gestalt language processors.
Sure. So most diagnostic checklists for language look for analytic development, single words, then two-word phrases, building up grammar bit by bit. Gestalt processors learn language differently, often starting with whole chunks, scripts, intonation patterns like echolalia, but it's functional.
But that might not tick the standard boxes on a screening tool.
Exactly. It can be misinterpreted as non-functional repetition or odd prosody instead of a valid different path to language, so they get missed early on.
Okay, so the key takeaway here, from the critique's perspective, is pretty stark.
It's crucial. When the Zhang paper identifies these two genetic subtypes based purely on diagnosis age, the critique claims it's not finding biology, it's finding access to resources. It's mapping privilege.
And then labeling that map genetics.
Yes. The categories aren't etched in the genome, they argue. They are, quote, etched by power. Diagnosis becomes less a neutral medical act and more like a policy instrument where recognition is systematically rationed, favoring certain kinds of people.
This systematic sorting, then, is what the critique argues actually manufactures the two subtypes. They aren't discovered, they're constructed.
And then dressed up in the very technical, very authoritative language of genetics. The critique calls these resulting groups the two shadows.
Okay, let's break down these two shadows. What's the first one?
The first shadow is labeled core autism. This is basically the early diagnosed cluster. Because they got diagnosed early, often fit the prototype. Their traits, their impairment becomes the currency of legitimacy.
And they become the real thing.
Essentially, yes. They're positioned as the biological anchor, the standard. And their specific genomic profile, whatever the study finds, is used to, quote, bless the category, to define what true autism looks like genetically.
Okay. And the second shadow?
That's the blurred comorbid group. This is the late recognized population. And notice the framing, they aren't defined primarily by their core autistic traits in this model.
They're defined by the other stuff. the messy baggage they carry.
Exactly. They get pushed into this category that's primarily characterized by comorbidities, anxiety, depression, maybe ADHD, etc. They're described almost as biologically messy secondary derivative, not the pure form.
And this is where the interpretation of distress comes in, which the critique finds really alarming.
Deeply alarming. Because what happens to all that accumulated distress? The anxiety, the depression, maybe burnout, self-harm, everything that comes from years, often decades, of feeling like a misfit, being dismissed, masking constantly.
The trauma being unseen, unsupported.
Yes. That massive load, the critique argues, is then read back into their genome by the study's logic. It's interpreted as proof that this group just has a higher innate psychiatric burden, as if the genes cause the trauma, not the other way around.
Wow. So the outcome is taken as the cause.
Precisely. And this is where the source brings in an alternative framework, like the power threat meaning framework, or PTMF.
How does that help reframe it?
Well, PTMF flips the question. Instead of asking, what's wrong with you, or what genetic deficit causes anxiety, it asks, what happened to you, and what sense did you make of it?
So it shifts from internal deficit to external circumstance and internal response.
Exactly. And viewed through that lens, this so-called late diagnosed factor, this cluster of anxiety, mood disorders, etc., it isn't some inherent genetic bundle of psychiatric problems. It's the harm profile. It's the evidence of what happens when you're denied timely recognition and support. It's the biological and psychological cost of chronic masking, of systemic neglect, of being told you're too sensitive or not trying hard enough for years.
So the paper, in a way, takes the scars of exclusion,
quantifies them, and calls them heritability, turns reactive harm into inherent biology. Heritability by another name, as the critique chillingly puts it.
And that creates a kind of vicious cycle, right?
Yeah.
Because the tools used to measure these things might be biased too.
Absolutely. The critique points out that many standard assessment tools, especially things like Care Report questionnaires, are often calibrated on neurotypical norms. They implicitly reward the existing prototype, that external presentation associated with whiteness and maleness.
So let's go back to the Gestalt language processing example.
Right. Someone using GLP whole phrases, echolalia, rich intonation, might get marked down on a standard checklist. It looks like repetition or odd prosody or delayed functional language.
Even though it is functional for them.
Yes, it's just a different way of processing and communicating. But those scores, based on a misunderstanding of the trait, get fed into these huge genomic data sets as ground truth,
confirming the model's assumption that this late diagnosed group is just inherently more disordered.
The system finds exactly what it was trained to look for. It validates its own biases.
And this is where the critique takes another step back and connects it to the longer institutional history, specifically mentioning Cambridge.
Yeah, it makes a historical argument. It suggests that institutions like Cambridge, post-World War II, maybe inherited or repurposed certain older ways of thinking about heredity, about sorting populations.
What kind of sorting?
Things related to what some scholars call administrative eugenics. Not the overt, horrific stuff, but the use of bureaucratic systems, data collection, statistical methods to define who fits, who's normal, who needs intervention or management.
So the argument is that these older frameworks, maybe unconsciously, shape how research questions are framed today, how samples are collected.
That's the idea. That these historical influences ensure that the current sampling frames the data pools used for studies like Zhang's tend to reproduce the same kinds of bodies, the same demographic imbalances that were always considered the most legible or testable.
So the discovery isn't entirely objective. It's partly a continuation of past practices.
It's presented as continuity, yes. The two genetic factors end up essentially tracing the path of a pre-existing institutional pipeline, one that tends to reward certain kinds of privilege and recognize certain kinds of presentations.
It becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy baked into the research design.
That's the argument.
Okay. So pulling this all together, what does this mean for us, for you listening? The source material basically frames this whole debate as this incredibly high-stakes disagreement. Is the heterogeneity we see in autism a genuine genomic puzzle that scientists need to solve by finding subtypes?
Or is that heterogeneity actually a mirror, a reflection of how our institutions, our systems, gatekeep recognition, rationing diagnosis, letting certain groups through easily, and labeling the ones left outside as somehow biologically different, messier?
The critique's answer is pretty clear.
Unwavering, really. The split isn't fundamentally biological, it argues. It's bureaucratic. It's the shadow cast by the gate. by the systems of access.
And we really have to acknowledge the personal cost here. The emotional weight described in the critique.
It's immense.
It talks about late diagnosed adults, and it specifically mentions women, non-binary people, queer autistics, who are often diagnosed later, people who finally find this moment of clarity.
Yeah, finally understand their own life history through getting a diagnosis.
And then they're confronted with a major study published in Nature, basically telling them that their journey, their survival strategies, the very recognition they fought for, it just confirms that their autism is somehow derivative or secondary.
Or polluted by pain, or just a collection of comorbidities rather than the real thing.
It sounds like the ultimate institutional gaslighting, as the critique puts it.
Yeah.
Your suffering proves you're not the core type.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the critique insists people diagnose late. They aren't mistakes in the data. They aren't statistical noise.
They are?
They are the proof. The living evidence of what institutional exclusion and diagnostic rationing actually do to people. They are the human cost of that gatekeeping, which the system is now trying to validate through genetics.
So it leaves us with a really challenging question, doesn't it, for you, the listener, to think about.
A really crucial one. If a study's categories seem to perfectly map onto existing institutional pipelines, onto known pathways of privilege and exclusion.
Should we celebrate the discovery of two distinct biological factors?
Or should we maybe be looking much more critically at the structure of the gate itself, the gate that created those two distinct shadows in the first place?